The title of the talk today is Regrets. I've had a few. I'm very proud of the title because I thought of it all by myself with no help from anyone else while I was listening to an old Frank Sinatra song. Maybe after the service we could all try to guess which Frank Sinatra song. But regrets, I've had a few. The talk is, it's about how you can help others, your friends, your relatives, and your acquaintances, people who might have regrets or guilt about their past. Now, I didn't aim it towards you because you are all so well ordered in your life that you probably don't need it. No, this is for people who might regret something that they've actually done in the past, or maybe they said something that they didn't really mean. Perhaps they brought work home with them. It was a bad day and they took it out on their relations and their loved ones. Or perhaps the cruelest regret of all, they reflect back on the past and find out that they didn't do something that they probably should have done in retrospect. That can be the cruelest regret of all. Now, the only person in this room that I know of that it certainly applies to would be myself. I've had a few regrets. It should apply to Frank. But some people, this stuff just doesn't register. It's not all his fault, I guess. So how is it that we can help other people who have regrets? When we call into the radio station, we always say, I have a friend who, well, now I'm going to help you help that friend without calling in. Now, the first way that you can do it is through acceptance. And let me tell you a little story which might illustrate this. When Patty Jean and I decided to get married, it was a mutual decision. It was mutual. I don't know what came over. But we had mutually decided to get married. But the actual wedding itself engendered a little bit of discussion. What I had envisioned was a quick trip to Las Vegas, maybe a fun little ceremony at Elvis's Chapel of Love, and we get a witness out of the pawn shop next door. That would be a lot of fun. But however, Patty Jean was a little more traditional. I wish I had known that. She wanted to get the process started by getting me to ask her father for his blessing. Can you imagine that in this day and age? Well, I figured it had to be done. Now, her father knew who I was. I had played several years on the softball team he had coached. So he knew a little bit about my viewpoints, my lifestyle, my principles, and how my values and his values might mesh. I didn't think any of that would be useful. And I was right, it wasn't. Her father had several suggestions for how I could improve in several areas of my life. Happily, I stifled my suggestions for him. And the wedding went on. Now, we came to accept that we were different people and that any changes would have to evolve over time. And over time, we did come to appreciate each other. The point of this is to say that sometimes acceptance is about the best we can do. Paul, the Apostle Paul, in the book of Romans, said that when you encounter somebody of weaker faith, go ahead and accept them, but not for disputes over opinions. It's very wise advice because we don't always know why a person thinks the way they do and why they behave the way they do. Sigmund Freud, psychologist of some note, he pointed out that were we to understand all of the reasons for a person's behavior, it would all make sense. Well, I'll have to take his word for it because, quite frankly, there are some things that I will never understand. But I understand they happen. Maybe they've happened to someone you know that you can help out a little bit. Help them out with acceptance. Here's another way that you could help somebody who has a little guilty feelings about their past. Gently urge them to try to figure out what they have learned from their regretful action. Gently suggest, not demand, but suggest that they rethink their alternatives and their circumstances to, as the Greeks would put it, repent, rethink. Now, how many people here have watched the Dr. Phil show on television? Okay, those are the well-adjusted. I've watched it once or twice. Now, it occurs to me as I watch the show that Dr. Phil makes a whole lot of money by asking one question which covers a range of issues. That question is, how is that working for you? It's a simple question. It's a direct question. And it's brilliant because it gets the people that he's talking to reevaluate what their actions have brought to them. It gets them a first step on that journey to break some old, bad, destructive habits and perhaps think about adopting some new, better habits. It's very, very powerful. The good news is you can do this in your own way, in a relationship that you can probe ever so gently. You don't have to tune in a Channel 9 on weekdays at 4 o'clock. Not that I would know that. You can do it in your own way. Get people to rethink. This brings us to the concept of forgiveness. Now, forgiveness is kind of a follow-up to acceptance and rethinking. I was watching a show on television one day as I was flipping through the channels, and this particular show was about people in the penitentiary. And a lot of these people had been there 2, 3, half a dozen times. And the show was focused on asking the prisoners themselves, why is it that you have this pattern? You get out, you commit a crime, you come back. They're in, they're out, they're in, they're out, they're in, they're out. It's recidivism is what they called it. And the prisoners had different stories, of course, but there was a common thread that ran through each one of their stories. And that thread was that it really didn't matter, or so it seems, if they learned anything or not, or if they changed their behavior or not, because no one ever forgave them. They couldn't get a job. You check off the box, have you ever been convicted of a crime? You check off the box, that application goes right in the trash. Nobody would trust them. And what they found was that people feared them rather than forgave them. I think that's what we do sometimes, not just with prisoners, but we do it with our own families. We do it with our own acquaintances and our own friends. And it's self-destructive as well as not helping them. Confucius said that the more a person knows, the more a person forgives. And one thing that I think he knew was that when you do not forgive people, you're making that choice between forgiveness and choosing fear, and fear robs you of the joy of life. So now, I understand you cannot go through life being a sheep in the wolf's den. But maybe we can start small. You forgive a little bit, you get a little joy. A little more, you get a little more joy. You work yourself up to forgiving a lot, you'll get a lot more joy. That's how it works. It's the way it's always worked. And unfortunately, due to the nature of things, sometimes we have to forgive more than one time. We have to recognize that bad habits are sometimes very difficult to break. And there's a lot of what the old Southern Baptists would call backsliding. When Jesus was asked, how many times should we forgive someone who wrongs us? Jesus said, 7 times 70. That's 490. Now personally, I usually fall short by about 489. I'm going to have to try to do better. And I hope you guys do better. Because the benefits of forgiveness are real for both the community and yourself. And there's one final method that I want to point out today as being very helpful in helping other people deal with their regrets. Let me give you a background. As some of you might know, I was a substitute teacher for a few years at Flint Hill Prep. It was a tough job for me. Most of the kids were smarter than me. That makes it tough. One morning I was called in, they said, gee, Mr. Long, could you substitute for a middle school Latin class? I have no idea what Latin is. But I said, yes, okay, it's a few bucks, so I'll do it. And I went in, and it took the kids about 3 minutes to figure out that I was pretty useless in that regard. So of course, by the time that the recess bell rang, they ran out of there as fast as they could to get away from me. Couldn't blame them a bit. So I wandered across the hall to talk with Mrs. Brooks, the math teacher. Just as I was beginning to dazzle her with my knowledge of the weather, a small boy slowly wandered back into the classroom. Now, everyone here knows that middle school can be a very tough time for kids. They're trying out their wings, and they're flopping to the ground. They're testing their boundaries and getting into all sorts of trouble because of it. Well, this one boy had done something, just crossed over that boundary, and he had done something terrible, very bad behavior in Mrs. Brooks' class. We'll call him Frankie. Now, little Frankie came in, and he was sheepishly and in a very low voice, he said, Mrs. Brooks, I'm very sorry. I shouldn't have done what I did. I disrupted the class, and I don't know what else to do or say. Mrs. Brooks just smiled at me. And she said, Frankie, it's okay. It's all right. I know that this is not who you really are. Wow. In just a few minutes, that kid went from nearly crying to just beaming as he left the classroom. I said, Mrs. Brooks, that's awfully nice of you. She said, well, I don't know about nice, but it sure is effective. She said, most of these kids are really pretty good kids, and all I have to do is remind them once in a while, and I have no more problems. It works nearly every time. Wow, how powerful is that? In that one phrase, this is not who you are. All three things that we've talked about prior in this talk are rolled up into that. The acceptance, the rethinking, the forgiveness, all in one sentence. And here's the secret. It works for adults too. Eric Butterworth, in his book, Celebrate Yourself, pointed out that the most effective way to change someone's behavior is to believe in that person and let them know that you believe in them. And then act as though that behavior, and that change has already occurred. Wow, that rang a bell. I had heard that other places, in different forms maybe, but I had heard it from Gandhi, from Goethe, and from Joseph in the Old Testament. The reason this advice gets passed down through the ages, I believe, is it works. And here's a second secret. 2 secrets in one talk. It's no wonder no one trusts me. Here's the second secret. It can work for you yourself personally if you let it. If you have something in your past about which you feel guilty, you are crippling yourself spiritually. Chronic guilt is like putting on a warm winter coat in the middle of summer. It makes you miserable, but it doesn't really resolve anything. It's just not helpful. What would be helpful is some self-acceptance, some rethinking for yourself, and some self-forgiveness. Now, I'm not saying that what you did in the past is okay. Oh no, far from it from what I've observed. What I am saying is that you should try to become who you really are. Tap that inner core of divine spirituality that we all know that you have. And when you try to become who you really are, there's a big difference between that and trying to follow an impressive set of rules with amazing willpower to corral who you are not, your bad actions. By becoming who you really are, you will automatically and naturally be called to a higher standard of conduct, and you'll live on a higher spiritual plane. I think this is what Jesus was getting at. When people of his time pointed out that he did not always follow the strict legalistic rules of the Old Testament, Jesus said, I came to fulfill the law. Now that's a very subtle difference that a lot of people still don't understand, but it's a profound one. Jesus was calling people to try to follow that more spiritually principled way. So if at some time, somehow, by chance, you fall short in some way, I urge you to take the advice of Jesus and Mrs. Brooks. Become who you really are. Thank you.